It's nice to see you again, Paul and Ludovica, Daniel, Yulin, Lorena, hello. Hi, Ian, sticking with us through the days. Lorena, Cindy, hey. Good, so like we have done in the other sessions, welcome everybody. You can introduce yourself in the chat by saying maybe where you are from. So I would say I'm from distressingly warm New York City, and you can post the equivalent to that so that we have a sense who is in the room. And this is the last event of our 6-day conference, and very excited to have with us McKenzie Wark. I'm sure many of you know McKenzie as the author, about, among many other things, of Hacker Manifesto, Gamer Theory, Molecular Red Theory for the Anthropocene, and Capital is Dead. And so she's a professor of culture and media at Eugene Lang College, the undergrad liberal arts division of the New School. And then also there is the Twitter bio, which I really like, which is theory icon, bad Marxist, transsexual menace, and professor of media and culture, and so on. Yeah, so, and the latest book, Philosophy for Spiders, with Duke University Press. Welcome, McKenzie. Very nice to have you here. So we hand it over to you, and we'll then jump in after about a half an hour long presentation. We have prepared a question and then open it up to all of you to ask questions, response to the presentation. So here we go.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you all for having me. I know it's been, this is the end of your deliberations, so I'm actually going to compress the presentation part a little bit so that we can have more of a discussion, I think. Now, let me just find some slides for you so you're not just looking at my face the whole time. And I wanted to think a little bit about information ecologies, and then maybe it's a way of framing how the platform cooperative idea, or ideas plural, of how that might be, might sit in some sort of information ecology. So, and I'm going to be channeling some ideas from most recent book, or one, no longer most recent, one of the recent book, Capital is Dead, which is now available in Spanish and German for people who prefer those languages to English. So how do we start with a conceptual description of the present, of the moment that we're in? Like, how do we make concepts rather than just sort of inherit them, but you know, sort of like think our present moment? And so I want to do that through a question, really, and that's like, what if this is not even capitalism anymore, but it's something worse? So how would we construct concepts of that? Because if one frames it that way, maybe there are consequences for popular and democratic movements, forms of self-organization, and so on. So again, we also inherit forms of thinking about how to organize for the commons, for popular self-defense, things like that. But maybe we need to rethink those if we're thinking a little differently about the particular configuration that we're in. So I tell a little just so story about how this might be something a little bit different. And it's seeing the history of commodification in 3 stages, and each of which being a sort of qualitatively different kind of abstraction. And so maybe that starts with the commodification of the means of agricultural production, the move away from despotic regimes in some parts of Asia and feudal regimes in some parts of Europe that had reciprocal forms, of unequal reciprocal forms of obligation between subordinate and dominant classes and so on. And you replace that with the commodification of land. So land becomes a thing that farmers pay rent on in cash, and then you introduce cash into that. So there's a way you've developed this more abstract stage of commodification, this first stage of abstraction, as I'm going to call it. And then the second stage is the commodification of the means of industrial production. So it's not just land as the source of value, as the physiocrats argued. There can be others, and that's the sort of theoretical revolution of Adam Smith and political economy, and the beginnings of what we might think of as capitalism. But what if that's not where commodification ends, and there's a sort of third stage that's sort of even more abstract than commodifying land and then physical means of production, the mill and the factory and so forth. And the third one is the commodification of information, so that you can then control the whole value chain through the control of information. And so there's a way in which this repeats an earlier moment in history, which in many parts of the world had to do with control through the abstraction of owning the means of production, gaining dominance over agricultural production, and the intra-ruling class relations between landlords and capitalists generally shifted decisively towards capitalists in most parts of the world. And there are some significant variations on that elsewhere. And then what if there's a second shift in who the ruling class is and what the dominant fraction of it is, away from owners of means of production to owners and controllers of information, so that you could then control the whole value chain through agricultural production, industrial production, through the ownership and control of information. And that would give you the sort of leading corporations and their state partners today. So that's sort of the basic sketch. So maybe there's forms of class conflict then specific to each of those eras of abstraction, farmers versus landlords, workers versus capitalists. And then I've made up names for new classes and call them something else. I'm not wedded to this language. What if, and I say we because many of us would belong to this class, who are the producers of qualitatively new information? It's, let's call it the hacker class. And I don't just mean computer programmers, I mean anybody who's producing information that could be captured in abstract forms of intellectual property. So that's a subordinate class, maybe often a well-off one, but subordinate in the sense that, I don't own the means of realizing the value of the information that I create. I'm paying, I get paid as a wage laborer by the university and as a sort of temporary freelancer by every other person that I work for. And then who ends up, on the other side of those exchanges? And I've called it a vectorless class. The idea being that who is it that owns and controls the vector of information itself? Vector seems like a useful, simple word. The simplest version of it is in geometry. A vector is a line of fixed length, but any position at all. So it has one degree of determination, its fixed length, but any position. And I think of lines of communication as being like that. There's sort of like a matrix of vectors is the thing that dominates and controls the production process and control of populations and things like that. So, all right, that's vector, and then control through matrix of vectors, a vector field. Sometimes we talk about infrastructure or the stack. Network seems like a played out metaphor for this. And the thing to emphasize is it's designed for the extraction of surplus information. It's not like this thing that we're on was designed to facilitate human communication. It's not like Twitter is there to enable conversation. These things are designed to extract surplus information out of populations. So any other aspect of its design that we find useful is secondary. It's designed really for the benefit of a ruling class, and perhaps one of a new kind, that extracts surplus information sort of out of everything. So what's interesting is that it's a ruling class that can extract surplus information from, and a term I got from Trevor, thank you, from non-labor as well as from labor. Simply by walking around with this phone in my pocket, I'm generating information for, I don't even know which companies. So I'm not working, but I'm working for them, like they're extracting value out of activities that I don't even think of as labor and for which I'm not compensated. I'm not paid for at all. And I'm embedded in these networks for all sorts of reasons, like the whole of, my means of subsistence come through it, but also my social life, like my desire to interact and be with others and to share. That has all been abstracted, commodified, generates surplus information as well. So sort of a little provocatively, if capitalism commodified our labor, the vectorless class commodifies our communism, by which I mean the commons sharing the gifts we make to each other. Like all of that, someone is extracting the rent from now. And the context that that seems to happen in, like we call it neoliberalism for a long time. I never found that a very helpful term because it's not really talking about the technical infrastructural means by which these forms of domination, extraction, and control are run. And it seems to have been eclipsed a little bit anyway by maybe the story we would want to tell is the way in which this particular design of an information infrastructure enables forms of neo-fascism. And we're seeing the rise of multiple forms of that in multiple places. These are extractive socio-technical information systems that were embedded in, that were designed mostly for that purpose, but seem to be exploitable by all sorts of neo-fascist movements. And there's a way in which, fascism Mark I exploited certain affordances of the broadcast era vector, whereas neo-fascism exploits those of the post-broadcast era. So it's sort of borrowing strategies and figures and stories and versions of panic from previous eras, but kind of repurposed and sort of inserted into a quite different kind of vector, one that's much more fluid, mobile, distributed, and so on. So then we kind of need defensive tactics in and against that. And at a time when there's a kind of outflanking of traditional forms of popular organization, including unions, parties, and cooperatives, find themselves kind of hollowed out. So it's difficult using traditional tactics alone. And things like the strike, the demonstration, the occupation, and the riot, as the sort of more immediate forms, all have their limits. So the thing about the vector is its capacity to root around most of those kinds of blockages. And one could think also about how the extraction of surplus information out of the heart of any kind of organization you might want to run now kind of makes it difficult. Like there's a kind of hollowing out of the internal spaces of organizations we might want for our own purposes. This entire university runs on Google now, whereas once upon a time, like other universities, it had its own autonomous information infrastructure, and we don't have that. So there are temporary measures, experiments in combining traditional forms and tactics with contemporary media. I'm always a little wary about the search for how we always need something new, maybe sometimes it's old methods or good methods, but we need to sort of think about selectively borrowing from them and adapting them to the present, including the legacy of the cooperative movement, which turns out incredibly rich and varied, and from which we might, maybe there's some old things we might want. And I think we learn lessons about the limits of social media through Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, the Indignados, other movements elsewhere, how there are limitations to what's achievable through those forms. They're subject to surveillance. You only get to evade surveillance for a minute before you're back in that space. I think I was taught by the comrades as an activist in my teens was always assume there's an informer. And I still think that's a really important principle. But I think more pressingly, noise and disinformation. One can get paranoid, but I think noise and disinformation are baked into the design of what's really systems of information extraction. So how do we operate in information spaces that are really not designed for us at all? So are there ways of hacking forms of self-organization, beginning with designing tools for democratic organizing to adapt the inherited forms of organizing that we have to kind of different media, technical, communicative infrastructure, and one that directly is subject to surveillance and extraction. But to move on maybe also to the democratic organizing of the design of tools. And I think we're still at that juncture of thinking through how much is the designer of the form of communication organization coming to it from without, and to what extent can the participants and in that become designers of it as well? Can we get away from thinking the designer and user as paradigm for these things? And what are the dangers and limits of that as well, to not be too utopian about that? I want to mention briefly the work of Yves Sitton on the ecology of attention. Strikes me as a useful, little sort of sidebar here. And Yves talks about 4 kinds of attention that he calls alertness, loyalty, projection, and immersion. And in short, one could think that, and the 2 more fun ones are immersion, projection, where immersion fascinates and projection bedazzles. And maybe we need a bit of that in how we think about information ecologies, and rather than keep getting pushed all the time into forms of attention that are loyalty, which sort of hypnotizes, and alertness, which excites. And I can unpack that a little bit more. Where, and maybe I want to go back a slide so you have the terms there. So when you think loyalty and alertness, think right-wing talkback radio, Fox News, or whatever the local equivalents of that are in your particular media ecology, where one is constantly being brought to be alert to a danger to one's way of life, where it's like this and that. And you'll notice it's always the same figures. It's the sort of the ethnic other, it's the migrant. And people like me, like those transgender people are undermining the order. We have to be alert and stop it, and then it's connected then also to a form of attention that's loyalty. That's all about, we've got to like circle the wagons. So it's, we've got to be aware of our presence in a group all the time. So these aren't necessarily bad forms of attention. And obviously alertness was very important in the pandemic, right? But and loyalty is very important to me as someone who belongs to the labor movement for my whole life, right? I'd rather use the word in solidarity with the working class rather than loyalty, but I think they're related feelings and related kinds of attention. But maybe we end up, because we have an information ecology designed to extract surplus information out of us, that we're unable to then project out of ourselves into the lives of others, including the lives of other species, including the lives that aren't anything like ours at all. How do we get out of ourselves, out of that sense of loyalty, into a different kind of attention to an other, but then also to situations, to environments? And that would be immersion. How do we have a form of attention to the immediate circumstances, and how those extend beyond a sense of having to always have a hard boundary around ourselves? So what I get from Sitton is that sense of one of our struggles has, in some media theory terms, this need to sort of rebalance attention a little bit and open up a little bit more to these different kinds of it. Because the kinds of information vector that the ruling class prefers is one that doesn't balance. It's only interested in extracting a surplus quantitatively. It's not interested in qualities of attention at all. So it kind of makes it part of our job to think about what qualities of attention we need to have a kind of plural commonwealth of being and belonging. So another thing is we get these positive feedback loops of alertness and loyalty. So there's all these threats at the border to my body, to the nation, to my community and all that. So I'm sort of alert to this thing that I'm forced into that becomes very exclusive. So that is then just, feeding into that sort of neo-fascist tendency. That's how we get paranoia and reaction. Other forces as well, but I just want to draw attention to the sort of vectoral dimension to all of this. So tactics for being in, simply for one's own, self-preservation, to kind of exist in a kind of noisy information ecology, non-ecology that's not designed for us, to think about how we balance our forms of attention as both individuals, as members of communities and so forth, how we think about opening spaces of participation of different kinds, partly through design, partly through practices, how we think about verification and trust, and that maybe forms of social trust come first rather than being something we can simply outsource to some kind of techniques. That negative feedback is a good thing, even though it sounds like a bad thing. How do you tamp down tendencies in our work to like ramp up a disagreement or to continually circulate around a piece of bad information? How can we have forms of decision making that are distributed but also use time effectively? I won't say efficiently, but effectively. What forms of organization of information do we have that can scale? What forms of partnerships can we have with existing institutions which may not share our goals necessarily, but where there are alliances around some limited objectives? And how do we encourage experiments with forms, knowing that not all experiments will work? Yeah, I mean, it's often said that cooperatives don't last very long. Well, neither do businesses. Like most businesses just straight up fail. Yeah, and at some point they're able to be a kind of anti-market force and have quasi-monopoly powers and simply become ongoing. But most businesses fail as well. So experiments are kind of fine. So can we think our labor and the techniques it's embedded in together? Albert Gold, John Haraway's Manifesto for Cyborgs is really helpful for that, to not always think the techniques are separate from us, but the way to be human is to have always been technical in a sense. The hand and the stone tool kind of co-evolved before there was even Homo sapiens, and we continue in that line. And can we think our ecologies of information in ways that include the non-human? Seems like incredibly pressing. So I might actually just wind it up there. I had a couple more things I could throw at it, but I'm at 24 minutes. So I'm trying to find languages to help us think through a struggle for a flexible, democratic, diverse, sustainable information sector where we can think about maybe what we need is to think alliances of three kinds of subordinate classes: farmer, worker, hacker, how we kind of all need each other, but have different cultures, different needs, different values, but maybe different things to contribute as well to kind of the problem of averting the alliances of a new kind of ruling class that's really based on extracting information and then controlling the whole value chain through ownership and control of information. And that seems now very, very willing to look towards kind of neo-fascist forms of organization to sustain that capacity. So I'm honestly not optimistic about operating in that space, but that's why I think all of our work is very kind of important in thinking how we would find our way through to a more just, equitable, diverse, endurable way of life. I'll leave it there. So thank you all. I'm happy to take questions, obviously, with the time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, McKenzie. And so our team discussed a little bit before which smart question we can ask you, which especially trying to make that bridge to our communities and the people we work with. And many of whom are really interested in a very sort of, actually practically making these things work. And so one of the themes that came up over and over again, and I apologize for the construction noise, is the notion of a cooperative commonwealth, and perhaps if that's too limited, pluralistic commonwealth, one that is made up of many alliances, as you say as well, between unions, social movements, and cooperatives, right? So because cooperatives have their limitations, they are not really working in all sectors and all sizes or in all territories. So, and I wonder if you can help out, I guess, this movement with your ideas on what would be, I guess what we are working on is a sort of like really big vision, like where is this all going? And I guess the pluralistic commonwealth is the closest we came so far, but I'm curious if you have input or feedback on that or reflections.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak in the place of people who do the actual work on these things, because that's another thing, is that the role of like someone who like me who talks for a living, I think, is just to suggest here's languages, and are they useful or not? And if they're not, then okay, I'll try to come up with another language. Other pieces may be orientations to thinking the histories that we inherit. And there's still plenty of, like, and it's like, oh, like I'm trying to be part of a movement. What's its history? And those histories do tend to separate out the history of political organizing from things like the direct industrial struggles of the labor movement. Like that will tend to be in, labor history is different from political history. And the cooperative bit tends to get left out altogether as like this third leg that, progressive social movements kind of always had. And then there's sort of even others, like what's the cultural history of the movements that we inherit. I tried to figure out the media history of German social democracy. It was all about, and part of it's all about magazines, like they're obsessed with print media, but they also did singing clubs. And particularly in the illegal periods, singing clubs and cycling clubs were two of the key ways of sort of cementing people to social democracy. And the singing club is a, classic media studies thing. It's sort of like binding people through time. Like you learn these songs and you teach other people these songs, and down through time, you're like binding people. The cycling club is a good way to like move around the different parts, and so that people are in connection spatially. So like, how do you think, so like a media history of how we build strong, I think a good word now is elastic networks of our activities and our histories. So yeah, I think those are the two things, is like, all right, so here's some language and let's keep experimenting with language, and also cross-culturally. Some languages don't work in other places. And then, sort of bringing in people who can speak to parts of the shared histories that we need to know. And again, also cross-culturally, I ideally love to not be giving this example from Europe for how a social movement organized culturally across time and space. I love more diverse examples than that. So yeah, I think part of our work is sort of making our senses of these things a little more elastic and denser in that way. I can call on people for questions if you like directly, if that's okay.
I'm sure there will be many questions. I will just use this moment to link to our anthem, as we talked of culture and songs. There is an anthem.
By our colleague.
Our colleague, yeah, composed by our colleague. Yeah, so now please, everybody, of course, Jerome is lining right up.
I have Jerome, then Jonas.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. And I actually have never heard of your work. And so this was a wonderful introduction to someone, yourself, whose ambitions are parallel to some of my own. And of course, the other people here, I think, or many here. So I heard a lot of terms and concepts that sound very familiar to me. And especially I like this indirect sort of reference to maybe Nietzsche with, capitalism is dead. So what do you think about the relation of this your observation to what Yanis Varoufakis has recently been talking about, referring to Neofeudalism? You used Neofascism. Of course, another individual who studied fascism, Karl Polanyi. To what extent do you read Polanyi or find inspiration in some of his categories, for instance, like fictitious commodities? That's one common question. And the second thing, your notions of hacking and design, these come up again and again in these discussions of platform, cooperativism, and platforms in general. To what extent do you think that arguments could be made, or transformative arguments could be made on the basis of aesthetics in general as a category, instead of, or in addition to ethics? So yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Well, that's a lot. I really respect what Yanis Varoufakis has done. I just hate this turn to neo-feudalism as a language, because it's just looking backwards again. Like how do you describe the present through this language that's from the European past that wasn't global? Feudalism is not a global experience at all. Like it doesn't speak to how we kind of have to rethink what capitalism was through colonialism now. And it doesn't really think through, I mean, we really have to think whatever capitalism was and whatever this is through the centrality of places like China and India to it, right? So yeah, I just think it's sort of like conceptually a backwards move. Like it's this failure to innovate with language. So I love everything else about it, but that it's just like, why do that? You know, and it's been tried. There's a book on that 20 years ago. So no, not a fan. I don't think it's helpful to, like, the idea of a fictitious commodity is based in a sort of metaphysics where like materiality is real and information isn't. And that's sort of the thing conceptually to break through. Information is also materially embedded and real, but it's ontologically weird. And how do we think the materiality of information and the way kind of control ended up in a materiality of information, but one that's just bad, one that's unable to actually value things. So I kind of like the work of John Bellamy Foster and what came after it to try to, and their language is eco-socialism. But again, maybe just putting old words together is not going to help, and we sort of need something different to that. I kind of intentionally went with neo-fascism because there's a way in which it does repeat all the old tropes. Like it looks like the same thing because it's the same anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant stuff and racism and hostility to any kind of queerness. It's all these old figures, but transplanted into an entirely new media form. So that's why both old and neo, there's like thinking the novelty of it as well. But as a thing that repeats these figures of, you know, like panic and withdrawal into an imagined ethno-state and all that. So yeah, I want it. That's why the only time I've sort of drawn on an old term. But I think, you know, like why Marx was great is Marx made up a new language to describe an emerging reality. And so I think that's the task, is not to repeat those terms ad infinitum, but to come up with new ones, particularly when like capitalists are happy to call themselves capitalists, and they're even happy to call themselves neoliberals. So like maybe we need a different language. And so that means essentially what's in aesthetics of the language that we use and the images that we use, and how can, like, maybe we kind of need to find new ones that are popular, and to sort of feed off the kind of memification of forms of progressive desire, and find the ones that we can hang on to and work with that have some element of novelty about them, so that we're not, I fear sometimes we do cosplay, you know, that thing Marx said of, you know, revolutions adopting the dress and style of the past, but when that's not going to help us, because then we don't see what's distinctive about our particular situation. And then I have Jonas.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi McKenzie. Thank you so much for this great talk, which spoke in many ways also to the themes of the conference. My concrete question, I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to give one sentence to contextualize the question. But my very concrete question is regarding two terms that you also used in your presentation, which is strategies and tactics. And obviously this is a longer debate, but I'm very curious to hear if you see a difference with regards to the tactics and the strategies that we might use with regards to these vectors of information. And the reason why I'm asking for this difference is because one of the major things that bubbled up time and time again throughout this conference, also here in Berlin at the in-person part, is that obviously when you're in a room with 80 people, especially after this time, COVID, you get very, very excited, and also it motivates you to work together and to build together. And a lot of what we're doing is movement building, of course. But then also, of course, the question is, well, how do we get from one stage to another, and what are these stages actually? And then kind of like, I have the feeling that maybe differentiating more closely between strategies and tactics would help to better understand the stages in which we are. You know, okay, this is maybe like the initial stage, just tease out what is this concept, but then to have a more long-term understanding of which strategies we could build, you know, to move beyond a certain stage. So I'm curious to hear if you theorize these terms in different ways, and if yes, what kind of tactics do you see with regards to the vector and the ruling class as it stands today, and what kind of strategies? So thank you very much.
I think there's actually three terms. And the late Paul Virilio had an interesting way of thinking this historically of an evolution. It's mostly about scale and complexity. And for Virilio, and essentially about war, that Virilio, it evolves from tactics to strategy to logistics, where those are the three stages, and war becomes fully logistical. World War II. So that's and his view is World War II is really just won and lost on pure logistics. That like brilliant tactics and even grand strategy didn't matter so much as who could manufacture and deliver the boots and bullets and rations more than anybody else could. And in the end, once the United States entered the war, that was settled, right? So that's one way to think it is. You know, there's a sense of scale, duration, complexity that differentiates three categories. And we don't really have access to logistics. Like logistics is beyond us. We may not even have strategies most of the time. So what are tactics in and against things where you don't control the logistical scale and complexity, or even the strategic maneuvering, but you've got tactics of enduring in the margins of that. And and it's interesting that they're contemporaries and children of the war, but Paul Virilio and Guy Debord I find really useful for thinking that. And Debord's contribution, you know, is again a reading of classic work in military strategy, which is to do with when we tend to think a hierarchy of strategies over tactics, but when is it reversible? When can a tactic develop into a strategy or flip a strategy? And where are those sort of opportunities? And Debord even built a board game to try to teach that called Game of War, which is an online version in beta of that game. That's one way to sort of, you know, think about that. So yeah, how can one think tactics and strategy is sometimes reversible, but as sort of having nested scales that one wants to build towards the capacity. Building towards strategic capacity would be one way of thinking what the goal is, you know, and that means, yeah, movement building, building up resources, diversity of resources, their connectedness, where we don't all have to think the same thing or agree on things, but we're able to move together when need be. You know, that's sort of the goal. Yeah, Ian?
Right, thanks. I'm fascinated and a little bit befuddled trying to follow your range of arguments and stuff. And I'm reminded of Negri and Heart in terms of inverting strategy and tactics. So the group coordinate tactics, but a multitude deal with their own strategy. But what I was going to say was, last week I got involved in another virtual conference on COP26, and there's this problem like the world's coming to an end, and I'm quite interested in ecological economics and this degrowth theory. Okay, now they locate the problem with the Earth, the planet, planetary system, with capitalism. No problem at all. So the root cause of the planet going is capitalism. And the people that have made the biggest hole in the planet are those with the most resources, and they tend to sit at the top of the big corporations and stuff. So that feels like a good unifying kind of project to address, you know, saving the planet, which hasn't really been visible, you know, until now. I'm going to try and link this to my interest in the Lucas workers, who use your metaphor for workers designing design tools and setting out a different strategy for technology and the notion of socially useful production, which we think can animate people now. You should tell people that story and then say, well, what are you going to do? Imagine a new economy, and that process replicated around the place. And the purpose, of course, might be to save the planet. And the other bit that came in on technology were the Luddites. I'm from Nottingham, and the Luddites became very animated in Nottingham. They didn't have a theory, but what they knew was that the technology that was being deployed and the means of its deployment was totally destructive. So they ended up in a sort of violent rebellion, smashing up machines. but what they were protecting was commonality. So their purpose wasn't to smash up machines, it was to promote commonality and to defend that as the basis of, you know, a society. So I've lumped together a whole lot of things there in response to your aggregation, and but really I hope there's some response to those things, but I've really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, to take it back in the other order, I mean, as I understand, the Luddites were a little selective about which machines they wanted to smash. So it's not machines in general, it's like those ones. And as you say, based on a different model or a different practice of like what production could be. And where sort of centering the attempt to defend the commons was key to that. Someone was giving me a little deep dive just the other day into one of the things that was lost with the enclosure of the commons in parts of what's now the United Kingdom was actually gender neutral pronouns. Like we sort of lost that. There were ways that people had of addressing each other that didn't presume gender, because it actually wasn't relevant in terms of certain kind of shared activity with timber getting and grazing and things like that. So there's a kind of like forcing of certain sort of social models as well that kind of probably happened with this, you know, sort of an attempt to make whatever subjectivity is map onto identifiable bodies that are either property or property owners and so forth. So there are a lot of threads to unpick where the Luddites, usually a word that's used in the negative, but I think actually had a kind of active sense of what the good life ought to have been. And you mentioned Lucas Aerospace, which is a really formative example for me. The Newcastle Trades Hall environment group, which was part of my training, you know, as a teen, were like very, very interested in Lucas Aerospace, because a lot of them were highly skilled workers. So they were thinking like, well, yeah, we have agency over the actual design of labor processes. Like that's different to just being a worker. So what do we want? And Lucas Aerospace, yeah, they were like, why are we building all these bombs? We could like retrofit buses to run on rails, like all sorts of great ideas that they had. And I think that energy is a thing that's worth taking to people at Google and Microsoft and so on, who go like, why are we building these tools for surveillance and control at the border when we could be doing something else completely different? Yeah. And I think maybe we kind of always needed techniques. I don't want to go down that sort of Heidegger path of seeing techniques itself as the problem. But what would be forms of elastic, you know, kind of endurable, built form, technical form for a different kind of commons, a more abstract kind of commons than the one that the Luddites would have wanted, that didn't scale and was going to get replaced. So we kind of have to not think back, but draw on the past to build things that have a survivable form in the present. I'm looking at something in the chat from Columbine. I like the idea of working together across sensibilities is a good way of phrasing things. Yeah, I want to get away from thinking that academics have big strategies and everybody else. Yeah, I think the role of like, you know, theory, if that's what I do, is entirely interstitial and second order, and all that I've said comes out of previous social movements that I was a participant observer in. You know, like I've never been a leader. I have very few practical skills. I just try to sum up what's going on and give it a slightly counterintuitive language, because we do need consensus language that we can operate in, but sometimes we need something a little different to that, which is a slightly counterintuitive language that gives us a little friction in how we're perceiving things, so that we can sort of pay attention in a slightly different way. And I think that's my role. I'm not trying to, you know, I think that that's been the problem with like the theory part social movements is its sense of having grand strategies, but I know nothing about strategy. It's not my job. I think that actually does come out of people who are doing work that people in this space are doing much more effectively. Because like if you end up being a writer, it's probably because you like sucked at all the other things. You know, I was trained to be an activist and I was bad at it, so I became a writer. So like it's really not for me to be, you know, saying do this or that, yeah. But it's like maybe these languages give you a perspective to think about something a little bit differently, and it's really okay with me if the language doesn't stick. That's a thing that's dispensable.
I guess I have a, so do you think you're more like framing and facilitating or coordinating or something like that?
It's just, you could think of it like this, like here's a way that these particular things that we're all engaged in maybe form part of a kind of a concept. And so like it's about facts and concepts. So a good fact is mostly true, but about something in particular. A good concept is slightly true, but about a lot of things. So that's the trade-off, is that the concept seems like it grabs together a lot of things, and it does, but it holds them very lightly. And I think it's useful sometimes to step out of a more fact-centered world to kind of go, wait a minute, I'm already organizing the facts of my existence through these concepts that I haven't thought about very much. So if I have a slightly different, slightly counterintuitive concept, I can sort of see the facts a little differently. And maybe that'll help me move forward a little bit and maybe wriggle loose out of some concepts I inherited and didn't think about too much. So the example here is like, we keep acting like it's capitalism, like we know what that means. But actually, maybe if you just try a slightly different concept, oh, maybe it's not actually capitalism, it got worse and it's organized in a slightly different way. Then you can go, oh, then certain facts fit in. Like why is social media so happy to let misinformation just run wild? Because it's the actual business model. It's not a side effect. It's central to the whole practice. So it's like, oh, so they're just extracting surplus information. Makes sense now. So that really limits what I can achieve in that space. So yeah, that's how I think of like what little I have to contribute to the ongoing work. And then I just sort of want to learn from work that goes on in various places and maybe rejigger the concepts or respin them. I'm just wondering, seeing what the link is to. Oh yeah, to a piece of Trevor's, right. Yeah. So I think Trevor and I have like parallel but different ways of thinking through what is practice. If you're an intellectual, and that's how we used to think of ourselves, I think let's think of ourselves as hackers of concepts, hackers of languages, hackers of organizational forms, you know, hackers of information.
Yeah, I don't know. So maybe Morshed or Peter, I don't know if you want to jump in, or Cindy, I don't know, Lorena.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I just said, I was just typing it in the chat because my voice isn't really in great shape, but I just wanted to thank you for the presentation and also to ask a question about something that I remember from reading your book some time ago, and I was sort of just trying to refresh you know, my memory about it. But I seem to recall that around chapter 5 of Capital is Dead, you talk a bit about the PRC, Chinese Marxism, and the Chinese state's approach to towards, you know, big tech, particularly within the country. And and you know, you discussed the vector, like first in the context of the West, and then in the context of how this idea operates within China. And I was curious whether, you know, some of the strategies that you talked about, for instance, alliances between hackers, workers, and farmers would be extended into these sorts of contexts, which are often underrepresented, even in, you know, gatherings like this one, or in a lot of the sort of the bottom-up movement building efforts that are, you know, taking place right now because of various reasons. So whether that's because of being behind an authoritarian internet firewall or being in a particular type of socioeconomic or class-based reason, being that they're not able to access this. And so whether these alliances in the end limit, to a certain geography, or how they can, extend to, let's say, to China, Russia, and so on. That's basically what I was just trying to articulate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to articulate like a universal theory. Like it's always going to be situated in the fact that I'm from settler colonial world is what produced me, and my worldview is always going to be Eurocentric. I just want it to be open. I wanted to know that it's limited and not really universal, and then open to be able to have dialogues with perceptions of what the big picture might be that come from elsewhere. For example, I find Kojin Karatani's work like really, really interesting. Structures of World History is just fascinating. Like it's trying to like rethink literally world history, but in a way that kind of centers the experience of Japan and China for certain historical moments. And I'm like, oh, right, that just really rethinks what you think the evolution of capitalism was. Like Marx had much more information about how it emerged out of feudalism, but how did capitalism emerge out of these parts of the world that didn't really experience feudalism, or where calling it that really distorts the category. So yeah, and it's sort of worth, I think, risking big picture theorizing, so long as we keep a sense that it has very weak power. Like David Graeber's posthumous book that he sort of co-wrote. I haven't read it yet, but I'm like, oh, that looks really fascinating, as an attempt to do that again. I think we got a little sidetracked with more specialized ways of thinking, which is helpful. But yeah, how can you propose what the situation would look like from Russian experience, Chinese experience, and then, so that one can be in dialogue with that. And I think that helps then also with languages, right? I mean, residues of Marxist language are going to play really differently in, former Soviet Union or current People's Republic. So one has to use some of that language very carefully. Yeah, so I think that's the task. And China's the big piece of that, right? Just in terms of the scale of it. It's kind of, for me, centrality to world history at the moment. Yeah, I feel like we're all peripheral to whatever happens there in some ways. So having our ways of thinking that's open to being in dialogue there, and trying to understand from people writing within that space of what that's like is sort of really important. And a little harder to do than say India, Brazil, Indonesia, and not to leave out the importance of what life is like for the large number of people in very small political economies, right?
I think, especially on that point, I think like the work of like the recent, in the last 5 years or so, that we're seeing of like Hui on like the question concerning technology in China, and these sorts of books that are coming out are really, I just started reading it recently, really rich for improving that sort of contextual understanding, right?
Yeah, too Heideggerian for my taste. Some of this book I deeply admire, but it took a sort of Heideggerian turn. But to me, I think it's actually really dangerous. But I learned a lot from the book about the question concerning technology in China. Joseph Needham has a whole other way of reading that, by the way. It's closer to the Marxist tradition, and I'm a big advocate of reading Joseph Needham at the moment. Who really centered that question of how what's now China was sort of the leading engine of developments in technical innovation for millennia, but then not for a brief modern moment, and trying to account for why. Like that's the Needham question. But where maybe techniques and power works a little differently in the Chinese state, rather than it coming through state and economy, rather than having to think that it's based on some conceptual difference. Oh, and thanks for
Just
mentioning
because
somebody
there's a lull in the
mentioned,
conversation, I make a plug for the today's Democracy Now! There was a great interview with David Wengrove. You mentioned the book by him and Graver. Very great book, and yeah, so just plugging that.
and thanks for mentioning Wengrove's name, which I blanked on, and I don't want to ignore the co-author there. So we're nearly at the hour. I think maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So if they want to be respectful of your time, unless Cindy still has a question, I don't know. Or Cindy Kotala, you look like you're getting ready to ask a question, but I'm not sure.
Well, I wasn't going to because it was going to be a really long question. But I just, because McKenzie, you brought up the word interstitial, and because I study Fab Labs, I'm not a digital maker or a developer myself, but I do ethnographic research, and I'm fascinated by the interstitial way that Fab Labbers build these, like, interoperability between these different worlds. There's mass production, but now we're trying to take it to distributed production. And I think that's what also, the like prefigurative or interstitial, the way that Kevin Carson also talks about it, that what are the new, the things of the new world that are being built within the old, like platform co-ops are probably that as well. But I think we also, because of your skill with language, I'm looking for a word that's a bit like, instead of surveillance, the hackers who are doing surveillance. So it's not just building better things interstitially, but like smashing what's bad. So
yeah, we talked about the Luddites, and sometimes, like wrecking the machine might not be a terrible idea. Thanks for pulling out the word interstitial. I think that's really helpful. And there's a way you could think the Fab Lab and cooperativism as related, and you probably have much better ideas about that than me. But thanks for like highlighting those connections. Yeah, I'm going to think more about interstitial. I might have used it in passing, but I think you're using it as a concept, and I want to think about that. And I'm happy to share the slides. I can send them, so it'll be available somewhere, because there's some I didn't get to. I thought I'd cut it a little short this time.
Fantastic. So I think this brings us to a close. Thank you so much to McKenzie Wark. Or maybe we can hear an applause if we don't see all of you, but maybe we can, at least we know that behind all of these boxes is and
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And to say, I guess, end with a reference to next year, we will be in the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro. Roughly at the same time next year, hopefully all in person together. I don't know, Jonas, Christina, Aman, you want to say some deeply meaningful last words?
No, it's been an immense pleasure putting on this event. Great to have you all join in different ways, digitally, in person. It was amazing. And obviously we, the EUW and the BZB, will continue this work here in Germany and Europe, and look forward to meeting most of you next year in Rio. That's it from my side.
All right. Great. Thank you everybody for coming. Thanks, Carla, John, Nicolina, and all of you. And thank you most of all to McKenzie Wark again. Okay. Thank you, and until very soon. Bye-bye.